I'd like to welcome the next presenters, so Peter Randall, Corporate Services Director, UK HCA, and Michelle Dumont, Policy Officer of the UK HCA. Peter and Michelle will be launching a cost matrix for domiciliary care. It's been created by a working group, which I was part of, and so was Maria and many other people I'm sure on this call. And Peter will also do a live run through the matrix showing the features. So over to you, Mr. Randall.
No, I'm going to hand over to Michelle to start.
Oh, right, okay. Over to Michelle then.
Thank you. I'm just waiting for our slides to appear. So, Prananda and good afternoon, and welcome to our session on the National Commissioning Board Cost Matrix for Domiciliary Care. Brief opportunity to be transported into the world of numbers that's fundamental to care provision. As Malcolm's already said, I'm Michelle Dumont, and I was a member of the Task and Finish group that helped to develop the costing matrix. I'm also a policy officer at the United Kingdom Home Care Association with a particular interest in home care in Wales. And I'm joined today by my colleague Peter Randall, who is another member of the Task and Finish group and the UK HCA Corporate Finance and Corporate Services Director. If I could have the next slide, please. So in this session, I will begin by explaining a little bit about how and why the cost matrix was developed before handing over to my colleague Peter, who will talk through the practical applications of the matrix and give you a live demonstration of some of its features. And after this, we'll explain how you can access the matrix, and we'll then take questions. So the next slide, please. We would like to emphasise that the cost matrix is specific to Wales, and as we will see in more detail later, it does take into account Wales-specific factors, and it was developed with input from home care providers in Wales. It's designed for adult home care, aka domiciliary care, and it was developed for the National Commissioning Board by a Task and Finish group, which Peter and I participated in. Next slide, please. So why did we develop the matrix and how did we do it? Next slide, please. The Social Care Wales Care and Support at Home Strategic Plan was developed in 2017, and this is part of what's led us here. As you can see on the slide, the plan identified the need for a commissioning toolkit and for funding options that support sustainable provision. And some of the policy motivations behind this work included recognition of the need to prioritise sustainable funding, need for easy, transparent tools for purchasing care, and the need for consistency. So on to the next slide, please. So during the past year, the National Commissioning Board had a work plan, AIM, which was to measure the costs of quality care and support. And in order to do this, a Task and Finish group was formed to look at evidence of cost pressures facing social care providers and approaches to cost calculation and fee setting. It was evident that some differences in how costs are managed in different care settings, so there was a subgroup established to look at these questions specifically in relation to home care. The outcome of the work of the Task and Finish group has been a guideline a costing matrix and a report. And while we're focusing on the matrix today, I understand that the report is also available too. And this contains details of the work that the subgroups on other care settings undertook as well. Next slide, please. So some of the aims of producing the matrix included the need to support sustainable provision by understanding the real costs and cost pressures facing providers, to be able to demonstrate transparency on costs, and Peter will say more about how this can be important in a few minutes. Consistent methods are obviously really important when trying to undertake comparisons, and while pay is a significant proportion of cost in care delivery, there's a lot of other hidden costs. So this model should provide a consistent way of submitting and demonstrating that full range of costs to commissioners, and also a consistent way for commissioners to understand costings. It was an aim to ensure that the method also had some flexibility so that you could enter alternative values to understand costs in different contexts. So on the next slide. So if we move on now to how the matrix was developed. The National Commissioning Board subgroup that was leading the work included a representation from the National Provider Forum Wales, the United Kingdom Home Care Association, and Care Forum Wales, and it was developed with input from provider organisations in Wales beyond those representatives also. There was consultation undertaken with people who were responsible for finance in a number of provider organisations when developing our understanding of the costs. And this means that the matrix is informed by how providers actually work, and the assumptions in it have been tested with providers and informed by actual commercial values. So it's not just a finger in the air or an estimate on our part. So on the next slide, please. I'm now going to hand over to Peter, who's going to explain some of the practical applications and demonstrate the costing matrix.
Thank you, Michelle. I now want to go through the more practical aspects of the matrix, highlight some of the benefits of using the model, and address some of the questions that I'm sure will be going through your minds. Next slide, please. So what are the practical benefits for providers? Just highlighting the more obvious ones, the matrix will allow providers to demonstrate and explain their actual costs in a consistent manner. Also provides for a discussion when fee rates are considered not to be sustainable for the provider to accept. And probably the more important it acts as a checklist for providers to ensure that all their costs are included in the calculations. Next slide, please. Ensuring that all costs submitted represents a rate that shows that the provider will be able to offer a quality service at a fair price. Fully appreciate what the costs incurred are, both for staffing and those overheads required for running the business, and to recognise and appreciate the impact of cost increases and show where savings can be achieved and reinvestment, providing that any surplus generated will allow. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so what are the practical benefits for commissioners? And again, just highlighting some of the obvious. It will give a strong message that rates currently offered may not reflect adequately the scale of the funding needed to ensure market stability and market shaping. And by providing a common template that allows commissioning teams to fully engage with and understand providers' costs. This will also eliminate the various methods and spreadsheet models that individual local authorities currently use and ask providers to demonstrate their cost. And as I've said before, this would assist in ensuring market stability and aid market shaping by reducing the need to submit a variety of costing formats and be aware of what a fair rate for provision is. So the whole concept can be summarised as simple to use, no complicated or over-complex templates that are open to interpretation and time-consuming to complete. It's clear, it's straightforward, and as Michelle said, it can be used by all providers, large and small, and be adaptable to cover all trading circumstances. For example, urban, rural, localised, etc. And it's flexible enough for individual providers to demonstrate their commercial situation. Next slide, please. This slide provides a guideline of what a fair cost for care might look like. I probably can hear a sharp intake of breath from commissioners and from providers, if only. I'll demonstrate the logic of them in a short while, but the values used to form these rates are based on the typical service and operation conditions using informed and verified information. The values have been provided and agreed by a number of organisations and then road tested to make sure that the logic is sound. Can I have the next slide, please? With any costing models, there are bound to be questions that immediately spring to mind, including COVID-related costs. There are anticipated costs in some areas to allow for predictable rises in business costs, for example, insurance premiums, but there may also be reductions, for example, in the cost of postage. Under the cost pressures, there is a possibility of merging cost pressures that will drive costs up, including, for example, if recruitment became harder. There are higher sickness absent rates and changes perhaps to registration criteria. Probably one of the most key things to any model is that how is the model going to be updated and kept updated? There will be a working group established to review the model periodically to ensure that the guidelines recommended are a true reflection of the activity levels. The model also uses different wage rates. As we've seen in the last slide, the model allows you to consider the implications on total costs of different wage rates. We've used the minimum wage rate and a real living wage in the example, but you can use any variation on that. There are different costs for hour, half hour. Half an hour of care delivered is more expensive than half of the hourly rates because there are a number of factors to consider, not least increased travel time. The model itself does not assume parity in terms of conditions with public sector. It is more closely aligned with conditions in the private and third sector at present. And costing uplifts. An annual CPI uplift in fees is unlikely to affect the cost increases care providers are experiencing. The cost of wages in particular is important in home care because roughly 75% of wage related. Next slide, please. Right, I'm going to share my screen, providing I can do it, with you to show you a very quick demonstration of the model. And what you're about to see is the beta version that the group developed, and the finished version reflects these principles. Right, this model, the layout of this model has had some input as well from commissioners on the information that they would like to see. Now, the boxes that are highlighted in yellow are the boxes that a provider can use to their own commercial understanding of their business. So anything that changes within those boxes will affect the hourly costs. And on the right hand side over here, what we have is the equivalent rate that is for a portion of the hours, the 45 minutes, the 30 to 15. So any changes within the actual model itself will be reflected in that summary. Similarly, where we've got the real living wage, you could put any particular wage rate that you want. So if you were asked what would be the effect of a £10 an hour wage, then you just change the value in that particular box and it will be reflected into the equivalent rates. So if it was £10, can then immediately see how the movement of that is reflected in the costings. Now the model itself, there are a number of boxes where you could hover across and it will actually give you a clear understanding of what should go in that box. Now we have simplified the information that's gone in those boxes because typically it's more involved with that. So what we've put down here are what we believe is a fair assumption based on the knowledge that we've gathered from individual providers and also the finance team at the organisation, the provider organisations. Now, just moving down, there are certain Welsh-related costs, and part of those costs are the worker registration costs and the registration qualification costs. These percentages, please bear in mind, are guides. Each organisation has the discretion, the power, whatever you want to call it, to change those values to reflect their commercial activities. So this is purely a guide. It's a reasonable guide, it's a fair guide. And as you can see here, that we have wage-related costs are coming out at £15 an hour based on the national minimum wage. So just moving down a little bit further, we then come out with the business costs, and it then gives a total then of the total cost of the business and the wage related costs. In addition, we considered, or the subgroup considered, that there are some hidden costs that need to be emphasized, and that is all about, that's around the recruitment and retention. And so what we have done is put in an additional set of boxes, and these values in here are really just numbers I picked out the air, if you like, and they should be related to an individual organisation. So if, for instance, an organisation has 50 members of staff and the staff turnover rate is 35%, and the organisation is doing 1,200 hours a week, the hidden costs of 2,155 is the value of the registration and the qualification costs needed to replace those particular members of staff. So the model is very adaptable. It can be used on a number of situations and circumstances, but this model, it will be available. It will be able to demonstrate costs, and as I've said earlier, it is a checklist to provide to providers to ensure that they have covered all of their costs. So I'm going to stop sharing, if I can remember how to do it. Can we go back to the slides, please? Okay, so now I'm sure that you're all very eager to use this costing matrix and really want to know where you can get your hands on a download. Wow, can I have the next slide, please? There is no contact in there. Will we be able to put that URL in there at some stage?
Sincere apologies there, Peter. We thought we'd added that into the presentation. I will stick it in the chat now. Really sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. And if you do have questions about the model, then please email us on the email address shown, and we'll be happy to take individual queries on the email and come back to you, because I'm sure that there will be some queries on how to use this model. So thank you very much for listening, and back to Malcolm.
Thank you, Peter. That was an excellent presentation. Diolch yn fawr iawn.